This is a video about social analysis, I guess. It's also one about the use of social theory. One of the things that I spend a lot of time thinking about at the minute over summer while I'm writing a book up is how theory and research are intertwined. And what I'll do with this video is I'll provide a little bit of context. From that, we'll build into a way in which people can think about social analysis or just analysis in general about different ideas. And then I'll try and give a bit of an example to conclude. I think this is kind of useful for anybody who's trying to explain stuff. That can be in an academic sense or not. So hopefully there'll be quite a lot of use for people. And just one note for people who are studying, writing essays and the like, you'll find within this sort of analysis a way in which you can construct a framework for an essay. So as I'm talking, if you're that sort of person who's undergraduate, masters, etc., or even postgraduate PhD students who are writing literature reviews, you'll find the way I frame this is very useful as a chapter or an essay structure. So that's just one thing to think on there. But for people who are not in that sort of area, hopefully you'll find some utility here in terms of how you can explain stuff, how we make sense of the world around us in a kind of in a slightly more systematic sense than we might do normally. So the first thing, a little bit of context. So one problem that I've consistently buttered my head up against in academia is people using what I would describe as overly complex theory, theory that is used to describe things that are relatively simple but with really complex language. So I think that's a kind of a wide problem which some of what I talk about today may tackle. And then within that, a kind of a more generalized idea is that when I do a lot of teaching with people and when I help people within my consultancy business to try and understand the world that they're in, I find that people often miss certain elements that are key within an explanation. So they might have one bit, or this is part of the explanation, but we might call that necessary but insufficient. A necessary part of the analysis but insufficient on its own. And you need the other elements to fit in. So that's something that I find in a kind of more not so wide, but in specific case studies. And then personally, why I do these videos is because a couple of things. One is I spend quite a lot of time thinking about these ideas in relation to teaching that I do, as I've already highlighted. My PhD student who's currently working with me is just figuring some of these ideas out as well. So I'm having to rethink about them and put them into different words, different contexts for her. And also these videos, when we're at the start of term now, and I've got a lot of different things going on. I'm recording a lot of content with people, and I use these ideas to frame how I have conversations with people about certain ideas. I'm going to be recording one at 10 o'clock about drug use, and I'll use some of these ideas to frame that. So a lot of these thoughts are buzzing around in my head. So there's a personal reason for this context. There's a personal justification and a reasoning that's part of this context as well. And what I've done there in providing context is actually do what I'm going to do later on, is I've given you a kind of more specific and then a personal explanation for why this video is happening. And that's what I'll do later. Go from the general to the specific. So if you missed that, quickly go back, watch that again, and you'll see it from the general into the specific. And it helps you understand why this thing is happening. I explained why the video is happening. More broadly, though, in relation to social analysis or an analysis in a general sense, a phrase which I use quite a lot, it's probably not mine. I don't know where these things come from a lot of the time. I don't remember stuff very well. That's the problem with having a very poor boxing career, is you forget stuff. Is that when we, especially in academia, we're looking at problems a lot of the time. What's the problem and how do we do something about that problem? So a phrase that's quite useful is that complex problems require complex solutions. Within my line of work, complex social problems require complex social solutions. So what tends to happen, though, if you can probably think of some examples from your own life, is that people see a problem and then they try and fix it with a simple solution. And the problems are generally quite complex when we're talking about stuff that we're dealing with in academia or social problems, something like racism or whatnot. A good example is when people try and stop racism in football. And there's a kick it out campaign, great little campaign, but it doesn't stop racism in football. Why? Because it's a simple solution for a complex social problem. The problem isn't racism in football. The problem is racism in a general sense as well. So if we have this kind of idea, we have to just pick the language a little bit, because one of the first things that I said was that I don't like complex social theory. And there's a difference between the way that we use complex. If you look in the dictionary, you'll see the two different definitions of complex, the two parts of the definition of complex. And the way in which we can start to think about this is a complex of things versus something that is complex and confusing. So multiple things together that are connected is a complex. That does not have to be complex in the terms of it being confusing and difficult to understand and hard to manage. So one way I like to think about this is a complex of ideas shouldn't be complex. Now it might be, but it shouldn't be. And as academics, one of our jobs is to bring together a complex of ideas, but that it should be something that everyone can understand. Think back to Richard Feynman's classic lectures, where his kind of basic premise is that if you can't explain something, you don't understand it. And if I can't explain this to you, and I can't explain this to my students, some of whom are 18 without much of a background in social science, then I'm not really doing my job properly. So I still need to talk about complex social issues, but I can't use these complex ideas. I need to use a complex of ideas, slightly different. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move on. I'm going to try and talk about what a complex of ideas looks like. And the idea would be that by pulling these different ideas together at different levels, we can pick through a complex idea, we can pick through a complex social problem with actually an alignment of ideas which are quite simple to grasp, nothing too challenging along the way. And we pull it all together at the end. And because we've aligned these different ideas, we've produced a complex of ideas, we actually have a relatively simple explanation. So the way that I tend to think about this, again, from the general to the specific. So we start big. So what are our big levels of analysis? And I think that this has to be thought of this can be thought of in any science, and any scientist could put in what their big explanations are. But for me, thinking about wide structural, institutional, historical, cross-cultural ways of thinking about the world. So why is something the case? How do we explain this activity or this behavior or this phenomena? Well, let's first look at its history, its time course. Where has it come from over the years? Is it the same from this country to that country? If there's commonalities across the Western world that shape this, what are the structures, the social structures that are overarching? Is there economic factors that are wide and across society? Capitalism, for example. So that's the first level of analysis, this really wide stuff. And this is very good for setting the context for the specific ideas that we're going to operate in later, because the specific behaviours that we come to, that we're trying to explain, fit within these wider processes. So we've got this nailed down. We've got this wider understanding that provides the context. Now, the context for what? The context for what is social interactions and social behaviours, which happen within groups. So here's the next level of analysis. Groups, networks of people, communities, teams, and just interactions between different people. So those wide social issues become what we might call mediated through these networks of people, these groups of people. So the interactions that you have with your neighbours, for example, might be the mediation of these big wider issues. So it's the second level of analysis. How are these big social issues, these big cultural, historical issues mediated by the people that you interact with? This is where they come from, right? You know, we learn them from something. We might read them, yes, but we also learn them from interacting with different people. Then the final one is the personal, the experiential. how I experience these ideas, the behavioural, what my behaviours are. I would avoid. I struggle with some of the notions that come from psychology, so I'm always wary to say psychology, but the psychology of some of this stuff as well. The biographical, the identity, where do those issues feed in? Well, my biography will impact on how I interpret these ideas that are mediated by the group. So these big structural wide ideas mediated by the groups that I belong to, and my own personal background, my thoughts, my experience of them will shape how I interact and what my behaviors are. So that's the third level of analysis. And I think if you tend to find within, especially any of my work, I usually operate on the bottom two rungs of that. I use the wide structural issues as a framework, as a context for the other two levels that I work at. And it's very difficult to present an argument with those three levels presented in a paper format. It's very, very difficult because of the limitations of words, and the different research methods that you use to collect data on one versus the other, especially when you move to either end, it doesn't really fit within an academic paper. It's one of the failings of the way that we currently do science and the social sciences is academic papers don't suit this sort of analysis. Books do, explanations do, teaching does, and I think that's where we have our strengths, and that we teach these sort of ideas to people, and hopefully from these ideas people can go and use them to explain whatever career or work they go into. As long as they have those three levels of analysis, they can go and run with it. They don't have to worry about writing a paper about it. So just one way of just kind of wrapping this up and thinking about it all, I think this locks it down a little bit more, is these three levels can be thought of in a different way again, which is as related to social norms. So the wide structural issues, the historical, the economic, shapes what we might understand as a social norm, something that is normal within the world. Okay, so let's take, for example, men normally have short hair. Okay, relatively simple statement. Let's explain men's hair. So the wide historical thing, if you were a sociologist of men's hair, you'd be able to track where the history of men shifting to having short hair came from. You'd follow that process, and that will provide context. And then the specific group that you're interested in, you'd look at them and you go, right, okay, let's look at this group, let's observe this group. And this group would be a network of people that interact in a certain way around the notion of shortness of hair. Men have short hair, women have long hair. We've got to make sure there's a difference between men and women, the kind of sexist narratives. But then within that group, and if you've got kids, or if you've got kids in your life, you'll see how this interacts you can imagine this happening in a school setting, right? Within that group, you have the individual. Is that individual the type of individual to say, actually, yeah, boys do have short hair, and go home and say, Mum, Dad, I've got to cut my hair, I've got to have short hair? Or is that individual going to negotiate that idea, challenge it, subvert it, and take that social norm? And yes, it's mediated through the groups that they exist in, but they say, no, I'm going to do something different to that. So that would be a way of explaining that the quote unquote outliers, why some boys and men don't have short hair, is that kind of that these social norms are mediated through the groups, but they're not passively accepted by people. The individual has a decision to make, a choice to make, whether they passively accept or negate, challenge, subvert those social norms. Now, I've picked a silly one because it's quite obvious, the notion of like short hair, but put any social problem into that sort of analysis and you can work through it. And what that leads you to is hopefully an understanding of the wide cultural, social, historical, economic factors that shape things, where the group sits within this, where the individuals who you interact with sit within this. And that we have to factor in as well, virtual interactions now as well, of course. But then the individual within that process that makes the decisions to do that behavior or not do that behavior, to do that behavior in this way rather than that way, to challenge it in certain ways but not in others. And then that gives you the nuance around an explanation which isn't top down, but isn't simply bottom up. It has a little bit of a fluidity to it. Okay, a few thoughts there about theory. There'll be a few more of these coming up. This will feed into a talk that I'll do with Alex Culver later, and we'll be posted on the website, and also Alex Channon, where we're going to talk about the importance of synthesis, and also Jack Black, where we're going to talk about theoretical determinism. So this is kind of act as a basis for some of those talks, and I may well mention this talk and encourage people to come back to it as a setup for some of those talks. But look out for them as well. They'll follow on quite quickly from this one. All right, cheers.